For most of human history, the most important place on Earth was not a city, a river, or a shelter. It was a small circle of firelight on the ground. Inside that circle, people could cook food, warm their bodies, and keep the night at a distance. Outside it, the darkness belonged to the wider world of wind, cold, and animals moving unseen. For tens of thousands of years, humans did not simply use fire. They gathered around it, slept beside it, and measured the limits of their safety by the reach of its light. If the flame faded, the human world seemed to shrink with it. So, an unusual question slowly appears when we look back across deep time. If humans learned to control fire, why did so much of human life still seem to depend on it? Why 90% of human history was controlled by fire? Long before cities, long before written language, and long before people built permanent homes, the surface of the earth followed a rhythm that every living creature had to respect. When the sun disappeared below the horizon, the temperature dropped, the light faded, and the land slowly changed character. For animals adapted to darkness, this was the beginning of activity. For early humans, it was often the beginning of uncertainty. The human body did not evolve to see clearly in the dark. Compared with many nocturnal animals, human eyes are relatively poor at gathering light, and our sense of smell and hearing are also less specialized for detecting distant movement in darkness. This meant that as daylight faded, the natural environment around early human groups became harder to read and harder to predict. The shapes of trees and rocks blended into shadow, small movements could not easily be seen, and the distance between safety and danger became less clear than it had been during the day. In the earliest stages of human history, before the reliable use of fire, night was not simply a quieter version of daytime. It was a different environment with its own rules. Across large parts of Africa where early members of the human lineage lived, nighttime temperatures could fall significantly compared with daytime warmth. Even in relatively mild climates, the human body loses heat quickly when it is inactive. Without thick fur or insulating body coverings, early humans were more sensitive to these changes than many animals that shared the same landscapes. The drop in temperature alone could shape behavior, encouraging groups to seek shelter in protected places such as rock overhangs, dense vegetation, or natural depressions in the ground that reduced exposure to wind. Darkness also altered the balance between humans and other animals. Many predators, including large cats, became more active during twilight and night. These animals evolved with senses adapted to low light and could move quietly across the landscape. Humans, by contrast, depended heavily on vision and group awareness to detect threats. When light faded, those advantages weakened. For this reason, it is likely that early human groups reduced movement during the darkest hours, staying close together and choosing resting places carefully. Archaeological and ecological research suggests that early humans often used natural shelters such as caves or rock formations, not because they preferred enclosed spaces in the modern sense, but because these locations offered some protection from weather and predators. A cave entrance, for example, allowed a group to observe the surrounding area during daylight while having a physical barrier behind them during the night. These choices show that long before the widespread control of fire, early humans were already organizing their behavior around the limits of the natural environment. In this world, the setting of the sun marked a clear transition in daily life. Daytime allowed movement, exploration, and gathering food. Nighttime required stillness, caution, and the search for safety. In many ways, the human world became smaller after sunset. The distance people could travel safely shortened. The ability to see approaching danger decreased. Even communication within a group could become quieter and more restrained, as sound carried differently through the darkness. Over very long periods of time, these conditions shaped the rhythm of human existence. The daily cycle of light and darkness was not simply a background feature of life. It was a structure that guided decisions about where to move, when to rest, and how closely individuals stayed together. This was the environment in which the earliest humans lived for hundreds of thousands of years. And in such an environment, even a small and fragile source of light could gradually begin to change the boundaries of what was possible. As darkness settled across the landscape each evening, early human groups were not only responding to falling light and temperature, they were also responding to the limits of their own bodies. The human body, even in its earliest forms, was well suited to long periods of walking during daylight, to coordinated movement within groups, and to careful observation of the environment. Yet when the sun disappeared, many of those advantages became less reliable. Human eyesight depends strongly on color and contrast in daylight. At night, when those signals fade, the world becomes flatter and harder to interpret. Many nocturnal animals possess a reflective layer behind the retina that improves vision in low light, but humans do not have this adaptation. As a result, the human ability to detect movement or identify distant shapes becomes significantly reduced in darkness. Hearing and smell can compensate for this limitation to a degree, but they rarely provide the same detailed information that vision offers during daylight. In open landscapes where early humans often lived, these sensory limits mattered. A distant rustle in the grass might signal wind, a small animal, or a larger predator. Without clear sight, interpreting that sound required caution. The body's response to uncertainty often involved stillness and heightened attention rather than movement. This pattern likely encouraged early humans to remain close together during the night, where multiple individuals could share awareness of their surroundings. Biological rhythms also played a role. The human body operates on a daily cycle that responds strongly to light. When daylight fades, the brain gradually signals the body to prepare for rest. Even today, this internal rhythm influences when people feel alert and when they feel sleepy. For early humans living without artificial light, the transition from day to night was even more pronounced. As darkness arrived, the environment itself reinforced the body's natural tendency toward reduced activity. Movement became more difficult, visibility declined, and the advantages of staying still began to outweigh the risks of traveling through darkness. Temperature added another layer of pressure. Unlike many mammals, humans rely heavily on behavioral strategies to maintain warmth. Without thick insulating fur, the human body can lose heat relatively quickly when exposed to cool night air, especially during periods of inactivity. Early humans likely responded to this by choosing resting places that reduced exposure to wind and retained warmth from the ground or surrounding rock. Groups may have slept close together, a behavior seen in many social mammals, which allows individuals to conserve heat through shared body warmth. The need to maintain body temperature would have reinforced the pattern of gathering and staying relatively still once darkness spread across the landscape. Over long stretches of evolutionary time, these biological realities shaped how human groups organized their evenings. The hours after sunset were not simply an extension of daytime activity. Instead, they were a period of limited movement, careful listening, and close social proximity. Resting locations were chosen with attention to shelter and visibility, and individuals likely relied heavily on the presence of others nearby to reduce vulnerability. These behaviors did not require advanced technology or complex planning. They emerged naturally from the interaction between the human body and the environment in which it evolved. When researchers examine early archaeological sites, they often find evidence that people repeatedly used the same sheltered locations over long periods. Such patterns suggest that certain places offered reliable advantages for resting and protection during the night. These sites became familiar points within the broader landscape, locations where groups could return knowing that the surrounding terrain provided some degree of safety. Long before the reliable control of fire, the nightly cycle had already established a simple but powerful rule. When darkness arrived, the range of human activity contracted. The world beyond immediate sight grew uncertain, and the safest choice was often to remain where the group could maintain awareness together. Within these limits, the human night remained narrow and fragile. Only later would a small, controlled source of light begin to expand those boundaries. When researchers attempt to understand how early humans lived through the night, they often turn to the physical traces left behind in ancient landscapes. These traces are rarely dramatic. There are no written records from this deep period of human history, and many of the materials people used, wood, plant fibers, animal skins, do not survive for hundreds of thousands of years. Instead, archaeologists study more durable signs: the location of stone tools, the structure of cave floors, the distribution of bones, and subtle layers of sediment that record repeated human presence. Through these quiet pieces of evidence, a general pattern begins to appear. Many early human sites show signs of repeated occupation in places that offered natural shelter. Rock overhangs, shallow caves, and protected slopes appear frequently in the archaeological record. These locations were not always permanent homes in the modern sense. Rather, they were points in the landscape that groups returned to again and again because they provided predictable advantages. A rock wall could block cold winds during the night. A cave entrance could offer a limited field of view that was easier to monitor than open ground. In environments where darkness reduced human awareness of distant threats, even small physical barriers could make a difference. The distribution of stone tools and food remains inside these shelters often suggests that human activity concentrated close to the protected area, rather than spreading widely into the surrounding terrain during the night. This pattern fits what researchers understand about human sensory limits. When the ability to see and interpret the landscape becomes weaker, people tend to reduce movement and remain near familiar features that provide orientation and safety. Over time, repeated visits to the same sheltered places created layers of occupation in the ground. These layers sometimes contain fragments of animal bones, broken stone tools, and traces of food preparation. While the details vary from site to site, the overall picture points toward a rhythm in which daylight hours were used for movement across the landscape, while evenings and nights were spent in places that provided physical protection. In some cases, these sites also contain evidence that later humans began using controlled fire, but in the earliest periods of occupation, the archaeological record often reflects life before fire was a consistent presence. In those layers, the organization of space still shows the same pattern. People gathered close to the safest areas, leaving the outer edges of the landscape largely unused after dark. This quiet pattern reveals something important about the limits of human life in deep time. Without a reliable source of light or warmth, the boundary of the human world at night was narrow. The distance between individuals and the surrounding environment remained small, and safety depended heavily on geography rather than technology. The choice of where to stop moving at the end of the day carried significant consequences. A well-chosen resting place could reduce exposure to wind and improve awareness of approaching animals. A poor choice could leave a group vulnerable in the darkness. These decisions were repeated thousands of times across many generations, gradually shaping how human groups understood their landscapes. Certain locations became known as reliable refuges, while other areas remained places that people crossed quickly during daylight, but avoided once night approached. In this way, the environment itself played a quiet role in organizing human life. Long before cities, long before permanent houses, and long before artificial light expanded the human day, the nightly cycle placed clear limits on movement and safety. Within those limits, early humans learned to depend on shelter, group awareness, and the careful reading of the land. Yet this narrow world would eventually begin to expand when people discovered that a controlled flame could hold back darkness for a little longer than the setting sun allowed. At some point deep in human prehistory, the relationship between people and fire began to change. For millions of years before that moment, fire already existed in the natural world. Lightning strikes could ignite dry grasslands. Volcanic activity could set forests burning. In certain climates, long periods of heat and drought made landscapes vulnerable to sudden flames that spread quickly across the ground. These fires were not rare events. They were part of the natural rhythm of many ecosystems. After a wildfire passed through an area, the landscape could remain warm and smoky for hours or even days. Burning logs might continue to glow long after the main flames had disappeared. For animals moving through these environments, fire was something to avoid. Yet for early humans, it may also have been something to observe. At first, people likely encountered fire only as a powerful natural force. A spreading wildfire could destroy vegetation and drive animals across the land. The heat and smoke would make it difficult to approach closely. But once the flames faded and the ground cooled, the aftermath of a fire might have looked very different. Burned areas often attract animals that return to feed on new plant growth or on insects drawn to the damaged vegetation. Early humans moving through such landscapes would have noticed that fire changed the environment in ways that could influence where food appeared and how animals behaved. Even more important was the discovery that fire sometimes continued to exist in smaller, manageable forms. A fallen branch might keep glowing with heat. A partially burned log could hold embers beneath a layer of ash. These small pockets of fire behaved very differently from a fast-moving wildfire. They were limited in size, and their warmth could be felt without approaching dangerously close. Archaeologists studying ancient sites have found scattered evidence suggesting that early humans gradually began interacting with these natural sources of fire. The evidence does not appear suddenly or in a single place. Instead, it emerges slowly across different regions and time periods. Burned bones, charred plant material, and discolored layers of sediment sometimes appear in association with stone tools at early human sites. Interpreting these signs requires caution, because natural fires can also leave similar traces. However, in certain locations, researchers have identified patterns that are difficult to explain without some level of human involvement. In these cases, burned material appears concentrated in specific areas rather than scattered randomly across the site. Such patterns suggest that people may have been bringing naturally occurring fire into sheltered places or maintaining small flames for limited periods of time. Even if these early interactions were brief and unpredictable, they would have introduced a powerful new possibility. A glowing ember carried from a burned landscape into a sheltered location could continue producing heat and light long after the wildfire itself had ended. For groups living in environments where night brought cold temperatures and reduced visibility, this small change could have had noticeable effects. A faint glow might allow people to remain awake a little longer after sunset. Warmth from smouldering wood could make resting places more comfortable during cool nights. Over many generations, repeated encounters with natural fire may have slowly transformed how humans viewed this phenomenon. Instead of seeing it only as a distant and dangerous event, people may have begun recognizing that under certain conditions fire could remain small, contained, and useful. At this early stage, humans were probably not creating fire whenever they wished. The ability to produce fire reliably would come much later, but learning to preserve and transport an existing flame was already a meaningful step. It meant that fire could begin to travel with human groups, even if only temporarily. In that quiet shift from observing fire in the landscape to keeping a fragment of it alive nearby, the boundaries of the human night may have started to change. Once early humans began interacting with natural fire, a new challenge quietly appeared. Fire is not an object that can simply be stored like a stone tool or a piece of food. A flame exists only as long as it continues to consume fuel. When the fuel disappears or the heat drops too low, the fire fades and eventually vanishes. For groups that had not yet learned how to reliably create fire from scratch, losing a flame could mean returning to complete darkness and cold until another natural fire appeared somewhere in the landscape. Because of this, one of the earliest human skills related to fire may not have been producing it, but preserving it. Ethnographic studies of traditional societies that historically relied on natural sources of fire suggest that maintaining a small flame can require careful attention. A fire that burns too strongly can spread beyond control, while one that burns too weakly may die out before morning. Embers buried beneath ash can survive longer than open flames, slowly releasing heat for hours if protected from wind and moisture. Learning to manage these small details would have taken observation and patience. It is possible that early humans discovered, through repeated experience, that certain materials keep embers alive longer than others. Dense pieces of wood can smolder slowly, while dry grass or thin branches burn quickly and disappear. Placing fuel in layers can allow the fire to breathe while still preserving heat inside the glowing center. These techniques do not require advanced technology, but they do require attention to the behavior of fire itself. In this sense, the relationship between humans and fire may have begun as a form of quiet cooperation. People could guide and protect the flame, but the fire followed its own physical rules. Wind could revive it or extinguish it. Rain could weaken it. The type of wood available in a particular region could change how long a fire lasted through the night. Because of these factors, keeping fire alive was rarely a passive process. Someone in the group likely had to notice when the flame weakened and add new fuel before the heat disappeared completely. Even when flames faded into a bed of glowing embers, the fire still needed protection from wind or accidental scattering. These responsibilities may have encouraged groups to organize their resting places around the fire itself. Instead of sleeping far apart, individuals might remain close enough to sense changes in the fire's heat or light. If the flame dimmed or shifted, someone could respond before it vanished entirely. Over many nights, such small acts of attention could become a familiar part of human routine. Fire was not simply a tool used once and forgotten, It required ongoing care. Archaeological evidence from certain early sites hints at this kind of repeated management. Some locations show layers of burned material built up over long periods in the same small area, suggesting that fires were maintained in consistent places rather than ignited randomly across the ground. These concentrated zones of burning often appear alongside clusters of stone tools and food remains, indicating that daily activities occurred nearby. Although researchers remain cautious about drawing strong conclusions, the pattern suggests that fire gradually became a stable feature of human living spaces. In this stage of human history, the flame itself may have held a fragile position within the group's survival. A living fire could provide warmth, light, and perhaps a degree of protection during the night. But that same fire could disappear if neglected even briefly. The ability to maintain it demanded awareness and shared responsibility. In that sense, humans were not yet fully in control of fire. Instead, they were learning to live with it, adjusting their behavior to keep the flame alive long enough to carry it into the next night. As early humans continued to encounter and preserve natural fire, another gradual change may have taken place. What began as an occasional opportunity finding fire after a lightning strike or wildfire could slowly become a more regular presence within human camps. This shift did not happen quickly, or in the same way everywhere. The archaeological record suggests that controlled fire appeared at different times in different regions. Some sites show convincing evidence of human-managed fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, while in other places clear traces appear much later. Because of this variation, researchers usually describe the early history of fire as a long process rather than a single discovery. One of the challenges in studying this process is that natural fires and human fires can sometimes leave similar marks on the ground. Burned bones, charcoal fragments, and discolored soil may result from either source. To identify possible human involvement, archaeologists look for patterns. When burned materials appear repeatedly in the same location inside a shelter or cave, the likelihood of deliberate fire use becomes stronger. At several well-known sites, such as ancient cave occupations in Africa and Eurasia, researchers have found layers where ash, charcoal, and heated stones appear concentrated in areas that seem to have functioned as living spaces. These clusters often lie near places where stone tools were made or food remains accumulated. The pattern suggests that fire was not simply passing through the landscape, but had become part of daily human activity. Yet even in these early examples, the nature of that control was probably limited. Producing fire intentionally through friction, striking stones, or other techniques requires knowledge that may have developed gradually over time. Before those methods became reliable, human groups may still have depended on natural fires as their original source. Once a flame was obtained, the priority was to keep it alive as long as possible. In this stage, the relationship between humans and fire could be described as cautious stewardship rather than complete mastery. People protected the flame from wind, added fuel when necessary, and carried embers when moving across the landscape. But the fire itself still behaved according to physical conditions that humans could not fully predict. A sudden storm, damp fuel, or an unnoticed ember scattering into dry vegetation could change the situation quickly. Learning to live with fire required an understanding of both its usefulness and its risks. Over many generations, repeated experiences with fire likely strengthened human familiarity with its behavior. Groups would have learned which kinds of wood burned slowly and which produced quick bursts of heat. They would have noticed that embers could remain alive under a layer of ash long after visible flames disappeared. They may have observed that a carefully arranged pile of fuel could sustain heat through the coldest part of the night. These insights did not appear as written instructions or formal teaching. Instead, they accumulated gradually through observation and shared practice within communities. The presence of fire also began to influence where people chose to rest and gather. A place that allowed a fire to burn safely protected from strong wind and supplied with nearby fuel would become more attractive as a campsite. Over time, certain locations might be visited repeatedly for this reason alone. In this way, fire slowly started shaping the geography of human life. It did not yet expand the human world dramatically, but it began to change the conditions of night itself. The darkness that once forced early humans into complete stillness could now be interrupted by a small and persistent source of light. Even a modest flame could extend human awareness a few steps farther into the surrounding landscape. And with that small extension, the boundaries of the human night began to shift. When fire began appearing more regularly within human camps, its influence extended beyond warmth and light. Over very long periods of time, the presence of fire also interacted with the human body itself, particularly through the way food was prepared and consumed. Before the use of fire became common, early humans relied largely on raw foods gathered from the environment. These foods included fruits, leaves, nuts, roots, and animal meat obtained through hunting or scavenging. While such foods can sustain life, many of them require significant effort to chew and digest. Raw plant fibers can be tough, and raw meat can be difficult for the human jaw to process efficiently. The digestive system must also work harder to break down these materials and extract energy from them. When food is exposed to heat, however, its structure changes. Cooking softens plant fibers, breaks down connective tissue in meat, and makes many nutrients easier for the body to absorb. These changes do not create new nutrients that were absent before, but they make existing nutrients more accessible during digestion. For a species that depends on energy to support a large brain and active body, even small improvements in energy extraction can matter over time. Researchers studying human evolution have suggested that the regular consumption of cooked food may have gradually influenced both behavior and biology. Cooking does not require constant chewing in the same way that raw foods often do. As a result, the time spent processing food with the teeth and jaws can decrease over many generations. Evolutionary pressures related to diet may influence the size and shape of teeth and jaw muscles. Fossil evidence suggests that compared with earlier hominin species, later members of the human lineage show reductions in certain chewing structures. These changes are complex and influenced by many factors, including diet composition and tool use, but the presence of cooked food is considered one possible contributor. Cooking may also influence how the digestive system uses energy. When food is softened and partially broken down by heat, the body can often extract calories more efficiently. This does not mean that cooking alone transformed human biology, but it may have supported broader evolutionary trends associated with increased brain size and energy demands. The human brain requires a significant portion of the body's energy supply relative to its size. Any consistent change that improved energy availability could have interacted with this long-term evolutionary pattern. In addition to these biological effects, the act of cooking itself changed daily routines. Preparing food with fire required time and attention. Someone needed to collect fuel, maintain the flame, and monitor the food as it heated. These tasks naturally brought people closer to the fire during certain parts of the day. Food preparation became connected to the same place where warmth and light were already present. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that early hearths often appear near areas where food remains accumulated. Burned bones, charred plant fragments, and stone tools used for cutting or scraping sometimes cluster around these zones. Such patterns suggest that the hearth gradually became a center of activity within many camps. People gathered near it not only because it provided heat during the night, but also because it transformed the way food was prepared and shared. Through these repeated interactions, fire began shaping both the biological experience of eating and the social experience of preparing food together. Over generations, the simple act of heating food may have contributed to changes that extended beyond a single meal. It quietly connected the flame to the evolving relationship between human bodies, their environment, and the energy needed to survive within it. As cooking gradually became more familiar within human groups, the relationship between food and the human body continued to evolve in subtle ways. Eating is not only a biological act, but also a physical process involving teeth, jaws, muscles, and digestion. In species that rely primarily on raw plant material, these structures often develop to handle long periods of chewing and the mechanical breakdown of tough fibers. Many primates, for example, spend a large portion of their waking hours chewing leaves, stems, or other fibrous foods. Their jaws are built to sustain that repeated effort, and their teeth reflect diets that require strong grinding surfaces. Early members of the human lineage once shared some of these characteristics. Fossil evidence from earlier hominin species shows relatively large teeth and powerful jaw muscles, features that are useful for processing coarse foods without the assistance of cooking. Over time, however, later human fossils display noticeable changes in these structures. Teeth become smaller on average, and the jaw appears less robust than in some earlier relatives. These differences do not appear suddenly or uniformly across all populations. Evolution rarely moves in a straight line. Instead, the fossil record reveals a gradual pattern in which anatomical features shift over many generations as environments, diets, and behaviors change. The introduction of regular cooking may have been one factor within this broader transition. When food is heated, its texture changes. Meat becomes softer as connective tissues break down, and many plant materials lose some of their rigidity. These changes reduce the mechanical effort required to chew and swallow food. If groups repeatedly relied on cooked meals, the selective pressures shaping chewing structures might slowly shift. Over thousands of generations, even small changes in daily diet could influence how certain anatomical features were maintained or reduced. Researchers studying the relationship between diet and human anatomy approach these ideas cautiously. The evolution of the human face and jaw is influenced by many factors, including the types of foods available in different environments and the use of stone tools that helped process those foods before eating. Still, the presence of cooking introduces a consistent change. Food no longer needs to be broken down entirely by teeth and jaws alone. Some of that work is transferred to heat and preparation. This redistribution of effort may have allowed the human body to allocate energy in slightly different ways. Digestion also plays a role in this process. The human digestive system is relatively shorter in some sections compared with that of many plant-eating animals. Cooking can assist digestion by breaking down certain chemical structures in food before it enters the body. In doing so, it may reduce the energy required for digestion itself. If the body spends less energy processing food internally, more energy becomes available for other biological functions. Over very long evolutionary timescales, these subtle shifts can contribute to broader patterns in how a species allocates resources. The human brain, for instance, demands a large share of the body's daily energy. While no single factor explains the growth of the human brain, access to more efficient sources of calories may have supported the increasing metabolic demands associated with larger brains. Cooking, by improving the availability of calories from both plant and animal foods, may have played a quiet supporting role in this process. The presence of fire therefore extended beyond warmth and protection. It became intertwined with the way energy moved through the human body. The flame altered the physical structure of food, and through that change it may have gradually influenced the biological structures responsible for chewing, digestion, and energy use. Over many generations, this interaction between fire and the human body formed another thread, connecting the daily act of tending a hearth to the deeper story of human evolution. Over long stretches of human evolution, small biological changes rarely come from a single cause. Instead, they emerge from many overlapping influences that slowly reshape how a species interacts with its environment. The presence of fire within human life likely became one of these influences. When cooking, warmth and light gathered around a hearth, the effects did not remain confined to a single evening. They repeated night after night, generation after generation, gradually weaving themselves into the broader pattern of human existence. One of the most significant aspects of this pattern involves energy. The human body requires a continuous supply of calories to support movement, growth, and especially the activity of the brain. Compared with many animals of similar body size, humans devote a large portion of their daily energy to brain function. Maintaining this balance requires food sources that can provide sufficient calories without demanding excessive effort to consume or digest. Cooking, by altering the physical and chemical structure of food, may have supported this balance in subtle but meaningful ways. When plant materials soften and meat tissues break down through heat, the body can access nutrients more efficiently. This does not mean that cooking alone created the conditions for human evolution, but it may have helped stabilize the flow of energy needed to sustain increasingly complex bodies and behaviors. Over many generations, the presence of cooked food could have allowed human groups to rely on a wider range of foods that might otherwise have been difficult to process in raw form. Certain roots, tubers, and tough plant materials become easier to chew and digest when heated. Similarly, meat that has been cooked requires less mechanical effort from the jaw and teeth. These changes may have reduced the time and energy required for eating itself. In many primates that rely heavily on raw plant diets, feeding occupies a large portion of the day. Humans, by contrast, spend far less time chewing food compared with many of our primate relatives. Researchers have suggested that cooking could be one reason for this difference. If meals require less chewing, individuals may gain more time for other activities during the day. These activities could include tool making, gathering additional resources, social interaction, or caring for younger members of the group. Over evolutionary timescales, even small changes in daily time allocation can influence how societies develop. Fire therefore created a subtle link between biology and behavior. By transforming food, it may have influenced how energy entered the body and how time was spent obtaining that energy. The flame itself did not direct these changes intentionally, yet its repeated presence shaped the conditions in which human life unfolded. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that hearths often became stable centers within living spaces. Layers of ash, burned bones, and stone tools frequently appear in the same areas across multiple occupations of a site. These layers suggest that cooking and heating occurred in predictable places within camps, reinforcing the role of fire as a central point of daily life. Through this repetition, fire slowly connected the environment, the human body, and the routines of everyday survival. The act of tending a flame influenced how food was prepared, how groups organized their living spaces, and possibly how energy circulated through the body itself. In this way, fire did not simply assist human life. It became quietly embedded within the biological and social processes that shaped the human species across deep time. As the regular use of fire became more familiar within human groups, its influence extended beyond the body and into the landscapes where people could live. Early members of the human lineage evolved primarily in warmer regions of Africa, where temperatures were relatively stable and the environment offered a wide variety of plant and animal foods. In such climates, survival depended heavily on mobility and knowledge of seasonal resources. But as human populations slowly expanded beyond these original environments, they encountered regions where the natural conditions were very different. Nights could become colder, seasonal changes more pronounced, and shelter less predictable. In these environments, the presence of fire began to take on a new role. The human body maintains a stable internal temperature, but it does so most efficiently within a limited range of external conditions. When surrounding temperatures drop too far below this range, the body must spend additional energy to maintain warmth. Without adequate clothing or protective shelter, prolonged exposure to cold can become dangerous. For early humans moving into regions with cooler nights or colder seasons, this challenge would have shaped decisions about where to travel and where to remain. Fire offered a simple but powerful response to this problem. Even a modest flame produces radiant heat that warms the immediate space around it. By gathering near a fire, individuals could reduce the rate at which their bodies lost heat to the surrounding air. This warmth did not eliminate the need for shelter or protective clothing, but it could make certain environments more tolerable, especially during nighttime hours when temperatures were lowest. Archaeological evidence from sites outside tropical Africa suggests that the ability to use fire may have supported the gradual movement of human populations into new regions. Some early human sites in Eurasia contain traces of hearths or burned materials that appear alongside stone tools and food remains. While researchers remain cautious about interpreting these findings, the pattern indicates that fire may have accompanied human groups as they explored landscapes with cooler climates. In these settings, fire did more than provide warmth during a single evening. It helped extend the range of environments where humans could spend the night safely. A sheltered location combined with a small fire could create a pocket of warmth within an otherwise cold landscape. Over time, this combination may have allowed groups to remain longer in areas that might previously have been visited only briefly during warmer seasons. The influence of fire on human movement was therefore gradual and indirect. It did not suddenly open the entire world to exploration. Instead, it slightly altered the balance between human bodies and the environments they encountered. Regions that were once marginally uncomfortable might become manageable with the help of a fire maintained through the night. Over generations, these small advantages could accumulate, supporting longer stays in certain landscapes and encouraging further exploration beyond familiar territories. In this sense, fire became more than a feature of camp life. It began to interact with the geography of human expansion. Each time a group carried embers into a new resting place, the flame allowed them to shape a small, temporary refuge against the surrounding climate. That refuge could exist even in places where the natural environment alone might have made nighttime survival more difficult. Through these repeated moments, the presence of fire quietly expanded the boundaries of where humans could pause, rest, and continue their journey across an increasingly varied world. As human groups gradually moved into landscapes beyond their earliest environments, the challenges they faced were not limited to temperature alone. Each new region presented its own combination of winds, seasonal changes, vegetation patterns, and animal life. These factors shaped how people could travel, where they could rest, and how long they could remain in a particular place. In such conditions, the presence of fire did not remove these challenges, but it offered a small degree of stability within them. One of the most noticeable effects of fire in cooler environments is the creation of a local microclimate. A burning fire produces heat that radiates outward, warming the air immediately around it and warming the ground beneath it. For people gathered nearby, this heat reduces the amount of energy their bodies must spend maintaining internal temperature. During long nights or colder seasons, this difference can become important. Without such a heat source, individuals exposed to cold air may lose warmth steadily throughout the night, particularly when they remain still during sleep. Fire helps slow that loss by warming the surrounding air and the surfaces where people rest. Archaeological research suggests that many early hearths were placed in locations that already provided some protection from the elements. Rock walls, cave entrances, or depressions in the landscape could block wind and retain heat more effectively than open ground. When fire was combined with these natural features, the resulting environment could become noticeably more comfortable than the surrounding terrain. These sheltered zones allowed human groups to rest for longer periods, even when outside temperatures were lower. Over repeated visits, certain sites may have become known as reliable stopping points along seasonal travel routes. Evidence from some archaeological sites indicates that hearths were rebuilt in similar locations over long periods of time. Layers of ash and burned material appear one above another, suggesting that groups returned repeatedly and recreated fires in roughly the same place. Such patterns hint that people recognized the advantages of particular shelters and learned how to organize their camps to make the most of them. Fire, in this context, functioned not only as a source of warmth, but also as a predictable element within a changing environment. Another effect of fire in unfamiliar landscapes involves visibility. Even a small flame produces light that extends a short distance beyond the immediate hearth. In open environments with little natural light after sunset, this glow allows people to maintain visual awareness of nearby ground and movement. While the light from a simple fire cannot illuminate large areas, it can reduce the uncertainty that accompanies complete darkness. For human groups resting in unfamiliar territory, this modest extension of visibility may have provided reassurance and allowed individuals to monitor their surroundings more easily. The presence of light also changed how evenings were experienced. Without fire, the setting sun marked a sharp boundary between daytime activity and nighttime rest. With fire, that boundary became more gradual. People could remain awake a little longer, prepare food, repair tools, or speak with others while the flame continued to burn. These activities did not transform the night into full daylight, but they softened the transition between the two. Over generations, the repeated use of fire in new landscapes may have slowly increased human confidence in environments that once seemed uncertain after sunset. The flame did not eliminate the risks of unfamiliar terrain, yet it provided a small, reliable center around which human activity could continue even as darkness spread across the land. As human groups continued moving across different landscapes over thousands of generations, the presence of fire began to influence not only comfort during the night, but also the broader rhythm of seasonal movement. Early humans did not remain in a single place year after year in the way that agricultural societies later would. Instead, many groups moved across large territories, following changes in food availability, animal migrations, and seasonal shifts in climate. These patterns required a careful understanding of the land, including where shelter could be found and how environmental conditions changed throughout the year. In regions with strong seasonal differences, winter nights could become much colder than the conditions humans had experienced in their earlier tropical environments. Even when daytime temperatures were manageable, nighttime cold could present a serious challenge for groups resting in exposed areas. Without a reliable heat source, the range of places where people could safely spend the night might become limited during colder periods. Fire gradually altered this balance. A flame maintained through the evening could provide enough warmth to reduce the immediate effects of falling temperatures. When combined with natural shelter such as rock walls, shallow caves, or dense vegetation, the heat from a fire could create a small zone where people were better protected from the surrounding cold. These zones did not eliminate the harshness of winter environments, but they could make temporary occupation more feasible. Archaeological sites in parts of Eurasia show evidence that early humans sometimes occupied locations during colder phases of the climate. Burned materials, ash layers, and stone tools appear together in deposits that suggest repeated visits to these areas. While it is difficult to determine exactly how frequently fire was used in every case, the presence of hearth-like features in some sites indicates that controlled flames were sometimes part of human activity, even in cooler regions. These discoveries suggest that fire may have played a role in allowing human groups to remain in environments that would otherwise have been more difficult to inhabit for extended periods. Over time, such advantages could influence migration patterns. A valley that once served only as a summer hunting ground might gradually become a place where groups stayed later into the year. A sheltered cave that offered protection from wind could become a seasonal stopping point where fire was regularly maintained. Through repeated experiences like these, knowledge about specific landscapes accumulated within human communities. Certain places became known not only for the food they provided, but also for the shelter and fuel available to sustain fire. Fuel itself became an important consideration. Fire requires a steady supply of burnable material, and different environments offer different types of fuel. In forested areas, fallen branches and dead wood could be gathered relatively easily. In open grasslands, dry grasses and smaller shrubs might be used, though they burn more quickly and require more frequent attention. Learning how to manage these resources added another layer of knowledge to human movement across the land. Campsites that provided both shelter and nearby fuel became especially valuable. In this way, the geography of human travel slowly became intertwined with the practical requirements of maintaining fire. Over generations, fire was no longer simply an occasional advantage carried from place to place. It became a factor that influenced where people paused, how long they remained, and how confidently they could occupy landscapes that once felt uncertain after nightfall. As fire became a more stable presence within human camps, it gradually began shaping not only where people could live, but also how they organized themselves during the hours of rest and gathering. A fire does not spread its warmth and light evenly across a wide area. Instead, it creates a small circle where heat and visibility are strongest, fading quickly as the distance increases. Because of this, the presence of a fire naturally encourages people to gather close to it. Individuals sitting near the flame can feel its warmth, see one another clearly, and observe the surrounding ground within the reach of the light. Those farther away quickly lose these advantages. Over many generations, this physical property of fire may have helped establish a familiar pattern within human camps, people gathering in a loose circle around a central hearth. Archaeological evidence from many prehistoric sites suggests that hearths often occupied central positions within living spaces. Around these hearths, researchers frequently find concentrations of stone tools, fragments of animal bones, and other remains of daily activity. These patterns imply that the area near the fire was not used only for warmth during the night. It also became a place where food was prepared, tools were repaired, and individuals spent time together while the flame continued to burn. In this way, the fire gradually shaped the spatial structure of human gatherings. The circle of light it produced defined a shared space where individuals could interact more easily than in darkness. Within that circle, faces were visible, gestures could be understood, and attention could move naturally between people and tasks. Beyond the edge of the light, the landscape returned to shadow and uncertainty. This contrast between illuminated space and surrounding darkness may have reinforced the importance of staying near the group during the night. The arrangement of people around a hearth also affected how awareness of the environment was maintained. When individuals sit or rest facing outward from a central fire, each person's field of vision covers a different portion of the surrounding darkness. In such a configuration, the group collectively observes a wider area than any single individual could watch alone. While there is no direct record describing how early humans arranged themselves during the night, the physical properties of fire make such arrangements both practical and likely. Even without formal planning, people naturally adjust their positions in ways that allow them to share warmth and maintain awareness of their surroundings. The fire therefore served as more than a source of heat or light. It quietly organized the social space of the camp. Activities clustered near the hearth because that was where visibility and warmth were greatest. Conversations likely occurred there because voices carried more easily when people were gathered close together. Tasks that required careful attention, such as preparing food or shaping stone tools, could also take place within the steady light of the flames. Through repeated use, the hearth became a point of orientation within the living area. People knew where to return when evening approached, and newcomers to a camp could locate the group by the glow of the fire even from a distance. Over time, this central point may have strengthened the sense that the group itself was connected through a shared place. The fire did not create human cooperation on its own, but it provided a setting in which cooperation could unfold night after night within the circle of light. When people gather around a fire, the change is not only physical but also temporal. The presence of a flame gently stretches the usable hours of the day. Without fire, the end of daylight usually signals a clear boundary. As darkness spreads across the landscape, visibility fades quickly, and most activities naturally slow down or stop. Movement becomes uncertain, and the safest option is often to remain still and rest until morning. Fire softens this transition. Even a small flame can hold back complete darkness within a limited space, allowing certain tasks to continue after sunset. The amount of light produced by a simple wood fire is modest compared with modern lighting, yet it is sufficient to illuminate nearby faces, hands, and objects placed close to the hearth. This limited extension of visibility may have gradually reshaped how evenings were experienced within human groups. Activities that required daylight did not necessarily end the moment the sun disappeared. Instead, some tasks could continue in the glow of the fire. Food could be prepared or warmed, tools could be inspected or repaired, and materials gathered during the day could be organized for the following morning. Archaeological findings support the idea that hearths were closely associated with such everyday activities. At many prehistoric sites, burned bones and fragments of plant material appear near hearth areas alongside stone tools used for cutting or scraping. These clusters suggest that cooking and tool maintenance often occurred in the same place where fire was maintained. The hearth therefore functioned as a practical workspace during the evening hours. Yet the influence of fire extended beyond practical tasks. The shared light of the hearth created a setting where individuals could remain awake together after sunset. In daylight, people often spread out across the landscape while gathering food or moving between locations. Evening gatherings near a fire brought the group back into a smaller space, where attention could shift from the environment to the people within it. Researchers studying the evolution of human social behavior sometimes note that fire may have provided a setting where communication could take place in a more relaxed context. When the immediate demands of daytime survival slowed, the hours around the fire may have allowed for quieter interaction among group members. Conversations, gestures, and shared attention to the flame itself could occur without the urgency that often accompanies hunting or traveling. Although we cannot directly observe these interactions in prehistoric communities, the pattern of repeated gatherings around hearths suggests that fire created an environment where social bonds could be maintained and reinforced. Over long periods of time, this extension of evening activity may have influenced the rhythm of human life. The day no longer ended abruptly at sunset. Instead, it gradually transitioned into a quieter period in which the group remained together near the fire. The flame continued to burn as people finished preparing food, cared for children, or observed the shifting patterns of light and shadow. In this way, fire did more than warm the body. It gently altered the structure of time itself within human communities, allowing the evening to become a shared space between the active world of daylight and the deep rest of night. As the presence of fire became a regular feature of human camps, the circle of light around the hearth began to serve another quiet function. It created a shared focus for attention. Unlike daylight, which spreads evenly across the landscape and allows people to look in many directions at once, the light of a fire concentrates the gaze toward a central point. Flames move constantly, rising and falling, shifting shape as air moves through the burning wood. This gentle motion naturally draws the eye. People sitting near the fire often find themselves watching the changing patterns of light and shadow without needing to make a deliberate effort. In many ways, the fire becomes the visual center of the gathering. This shared point of attention may have influenced how groups experience the evening hours together. During the day, individuals often concentrate on different tasks. Some may search for plant foods, others follow animal tracks, and others watch for changes in weather or movement across the landscape. Attention is distributed outward, focused on many separate details. When people return to the camp and gather around the hearth, that outward focus gradually narrows. The flame offers a common reference point where the group's attention can settle. Even in silence, individuals sitting around a fire often remain aware of one another through the shifting light on faces and hands. This environment may have encouraged a form of social awareness that is different from the alert attention required during daytime activity. The slow movement of firelight allows individuals to observe subtle gestures and expressions without needing to look directly at one another all the time. Shadows move across the ground and the surrounding walls of a shelter, creating a dynamic visual environment that changes continuously while remaining gentle and repetitive. Over time, these conditions could support longer periods of calm interaction within the group. Anthropologists studying traditional societies have sometimes noted that evening gatherings around a fire often become moments when stories, observations, or memories are shared. While direct evidence of such behavior in deep prehistory is impossible to confirm, the physical setting created by fire makes this possibility understandable. When individuals sit close together in a quiet environment where movement slows and attention centers around the hearth, communication can occur in ways that are different from the rapid exchanges needed during hunting or travel. The warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of its light, and the safety of the group's presence all contribute to a setting where people can remain together without immediate urgency. At the same time, the fire continues to serve practical purposes. Fuel must still be added occasionally, and someone must remain aware of the flame's condition. These small acts of tending the fire reinforce the shared responsibility within the group. Even when people are resting or speaking quietly, the presence of the hearth reminds them that maintaining the flame requires ongoing care. Through these nightly routines, the hearth gradually becomes more than a simple tool. It functions as a point where practical survival, social interaction, and shared attention meet. The circle of light created by the fire forms a temporary center for the group's life, holding people together through the quiet hours between the activity of the day and the uncertainty of the surrounding darkness. As the presence of fire became a stable part of human life, its influence extended quietly into the daily rhythm of activity and rest. For most animals, the cycle of daylight and darkness strongly determines when movement occurs. Many species are active primarily during the day, while others have adapted to function during the night. Humans, by contrast, evolved as a species that depends heavily on daylight for vision and awareness of the surrounding environment. Without artificial light, the setting of the sun marks a clear shift in the possibilities of human activity. Yet once fire entered the human camp, that boundary began to soften. A small hearth could not recreate the brightness of daylight, but it could provide enough illumination to keep the immediate surroundings visible. This modest extension of light allowed certain tasks to continue after sunset. In many prehistoric sites, the areas surrounding hearths contain evidence of tool maintenance and food preparation. Stone flakes produced during tool shaping sometimes appear in layers of sediment alongside ash and burned bones, suggesting that people worked with materials near the fire's light. The warmth of the hearth also encouraged individuals to remain nearby while completing these tasks. Over time, the evening hours may have developed a rhythm of their own, distinct from both the active daylight period and the deeper rest that followed later in the night. The day's movement across the landscape, searching for food, observing animal behavior, and navigating terrain required attention focused outward toward the environment. Evening life around the fire, however, shifted attention inward toward the group and the immediate living space. Tools could be repaired, food shared, and the events of the day quietly processed within the safety of the camp. This gradual transition between day and night may have helped structure the human sense of time. Instead of a sudden stop at sunset, activity faded slowly as the fire burned lower and the group prepared for sleep. Biological rhythms also interact with this pattern. The human body responds strongly to changes in light. As daylight diminishes, the brain signals the body to prepare for rest by adjusting hormone levels and lowering alertness. Firelight, being dim and warm in color, does not completely interrupt this natural process. Instead, it creates a gentle extension of visibility without fully convincing the body that daylight has returned. In this way, the presence of fire allowed people to remain awake for a while after sunset while still maintaining a natural progression towards sleep. This balance between biological rhythm and environmental adaptation may have been important in early human communities. Groups could gather, eat, and complete small tasks during the early part of the evening without disrupting the body's overall cycle of rest and activity. The fire therefore acted as a mediator between the natural limits of human vision and the body's internal sense of time. It stretched the evening slightly but did not transform night into day. Archaeological evidence suggests that hearths often show signs of repeated use across many occupations of the same site. Layers of ash build gradually as fires are lit, maintained, and eventually fade. These layers represent not just individual fires but countless evenings during which human groups gathered, worked briefly in the fading light, and then settled into rest. Through these repeated cycles, fire became woven into the rhythm of daily life. The flame marked the quiet transition from the open movement of daytime to the slower, shared stillness that followed, shaping how early humans experienced the passage of each day. As the evening hours unfolded around the fire, the rhythm of activity within the camp often followed a gradual pattern rather than an abrupt change. During daylight, human attention is usually directed outward toward the environment. People watch the landscape carefully while searching for food, tracking animals, or moving between locations. These tasks demand alertness and continuous observation of distant movement. When the group returns to the camp and the fire is lit, that outward focus slowly narrows. The surrounding darkness limits how far the eye can travel, and attention settles closer to the circle of light. Within that circle, the pace of activity often becomes calmer and more deliberate. Small tasks that do not require long-distance movement can take place near the hearth. Tools used during the day may be inspected and repaired. Food gathered earlier can be prepared or warmed before eating. Materials such as plant fibers, wood, or stone may be organized for use on the following day. Archaeological sites often show clusters of these materials near ancient hearths, suggesting that the firelight created a practical workspace during the evening hours. The limited brightness of a fire does not allow detailed work across large areas, but it is sufficient for tasks performed close to the hands. This environment encourages people to remain seated or crouched near the flame, while focusing on objects placed within the illuminated space. The warmth of the fire also encourages stillness. During cooler nights, individuals naturally move closer to the hearth where the heat is strongest. Remaining near the fire reduces the body's need to generate additional warmth through movement. As a result, evening activity often takes place within a smaller physical area than the wide-ranging movements of daytime. This concentration of people and tasks around a single point reinforces the importance of the hearth as the center of camp life. Over time, such patterns may have influenced how individuals divided their attention between work and rest. The fire provided just enough light to complete necessary tasks without encouraging prolonged activity late into the night. As the flame gradually burned lower and fuel was consumed, the amount of light available decreased naturally. Unlike modern artificial lighting, which can maintain constant brightness for many hours, a wood fire slowly fades if additional fuel is not added. This natural dimming may have served as a gentle signal that the evening was approaching its end. One by one, individuals could finish their tasks and prepare for sleep as the fire's light softened. In this way, the fire participated quietly in regulating the transition from activity to rest. Biological rhythms continued guiding the body towards sleep as darkness deepened. The fire did not eliminate that process, but it provided a short interval where essential tasks and social interaction could occur before the group settled into stillness. Over generations, this rhythm, daylight movement, evening gathering around the hearth, and eventual sleep likely became a familiar structure of human life. The fire marked the center of that transition. Its light allowed the group to remain active just a little longer while gradually guiding attention away from the wider landscape and back toward the shared space of the camp. As the fire gradually burned lower and the evening tasks came to an end, another quiet change took place within the camp. The group began to shift from activity toward rest. In the natural world, many animals enter periods of sleep soon after darkness spreads across the landscape. For humans, The presence of fire slightly altered the moment when that transition began, but it did not remove the need for sleep itself. Instead, the flame created a brief space of time where the body could slow down before fully entering the deeper stillness of night. Within the circle of light, individuals might prepare the ground where they would rest, arranging simple bedding materials such as grasses, leaves, or animal skins. Archaeological studies of ancient sites sometimes reveal traces of these resting areas through patterns in the sediment, including concentrations of plant remains or slight depressions in the ground where repeated use compacted the surface. While such evidence is subtle and not always preserved, it suggests that sleeping places were often organized in relation to the hearth. Warmth from the fire could spread outward across the ground, making nearby areas more comfortable during cool nights. People resting closer to the hearth would feel this warmth more strongly, while those farther away might experience cooler air. Because of this gradient of heat, individuals often arrange themselves within a certain distance of the fire rather than scattering widely across the campsite. In many environments, the presence of fire may also have offered a small sense of security during sleep. The light from the remaining embers allowed limited visibility even after the main flames faded. Predatory animals that approached the camp would encounter the unfamiliar glow and the scent of smoke before reaching the group itself. Although fire does not guarantee protection, many animals avoid open flames and the unpredictable movement of sparks. This effect may have reduced the likelihood of close encounters during the night, allowing human groups to rest with slightly greater confidence in their immediate surroundings. The final stage of the evening often arrived when the fire settled into a bed of glowing embers. At this point, the light became dimmer and the warmth gentler. Someone within the group might add a final piece of fuel to keep the embers alive through the coldest hours of the night, especially if the group wished to rekindle the fire easily in the morning. Maintaining these embers could be important for communities that did not yet possess reliable methods for creating fire from scratch. If the embers survived until dawn, the first small flames of the new day could appear quickly with the addition of fresh fuel. This quiet cycle, lighting the fire, tending it during the evening, and preserving its embers overnight became a repeated pattern in many human camps. Through countless nights across generations, the flame served as both the beginning and the ending point of daily life. It marked the gathering of the group after the movement of the day, and remained present as the final glow before sleep. In this way, fire quietly structured the human experience of time, guiding the transition from the wide world of daylight into the shared stillness of the night. When darkness spreads across a natural landscape, the balance between different species often changes. Many animals that remain hidden during daylight become more active after sunset. Some predators move quietly through the night using senses that function well in low light, while smaller animals emerge to feed when the heat of the day has faded. In this shifting environment, early humans faced a challenge that was partly biological and partly environmental. Human eyesight, as researchers understand it, is adapted primarily for daylight conditions. While the eye can adjust somewhat to darkness, it does not gather light as efficiently as the eyes of many nocturnal animals. This means that the ability to detect distant movement or identify shapes becomes limited once the sun has set. In such conditions, awareness of the surrounding environment becomes more difficult to maintain. Fire introduced a small but meaningful change to this situation. Even a modest flame produces light that expands outward from the hearth, illuminating the ground and nearby objects within a limited radius. The brightness fades quickly beyond that circle, yet within the illuminated area, human vision becomes far more effective than it would be in complete darkness. Faces, hands, tools, and the immediate terrain remain visible. For groups resting together, this light creates a shared zone where individuals can observe one another and remain aware of small movements nearby. Outside the edge of the firelight, however, the landscape remains largely hidden. This contrast between illuminated and dark spaces naturally creates a boundary. Inside the circle of light, people experience warmth, visibility, and the presence of others. Beyond that boundary, the environment returns to uncertainty. The ground becomes difficult to read, and any movement is harder to interpret. Over time, this physical difference may have shaped how human groups perceived the space around them during the night. The hearth effectively defined the center of the camp, while the surrounding darkness marked the limits of comfortable awareness. Animals approaching the camp would also encounter this boundary. The glow of a fire and the scent of smoke represent unfamiliar signals for many species. While fire does not prevent animals from entering an area entirely, it can influence their behavior. Some animals are cautious around flames because the movement of fire and the crackling sounds it produces are difficult to predict. In addition, smoke can carry the scent of burning materials across the landscape, alerting animals to the presence of something unusual. These effects may have reduced the likelihood of animals approaching very close to a human group resting beside a fire. Archaeological research cannot easily measure how animals responded to fire in deep prehistory, but the widespread use of hearths in ancient human sites suggests that people repeatedly relied on fire as part of their nighttime environment. By gathering around a flame, groups created a small space where the balance between human senses and the surrounding darkness shifted slightly in their favor. Within that space, individuals could rest with greater awareness of their immediate surroundings. The fire did not transform the entire landscape into a safe place, but it provided a modest advantage at the center of the camp. Over many generations, this small advantage became an important part of how humans experienced the night. The flame marked a visible border between the known and the unknown, between the shared world of the group and the wider darkness that continued beyond the reach of its light. The presence of fire during the night did not remove all uncertainty from the surrounding environment, but it changed how that uncertainty was experienced. Without fire, darkness spreads evenly across the landscape. The ground, the trees, and any movement within them gradually disappear from sight. In such conditions, humans must rely heavily on sound and memory of the terrain to interpret what lies nearby. This form of awareness can be fragile, because small sounds may have many possible causes. A branch might move because of wind, a small animal passing through grass, or something much larger approaching quietly from a distance. Fire interrupts this uniform darkness by creating a zone where the human senses function differently. Within the reach of the firelight, the ground becomes visible again. The shapes of nearby objects reappear, and the movement of hands, tools, or other people can be easily recognized. This illuminated space does not extend very far, yet it provides a stable reference point in the middle of an otherwise uncertain landscape. Humans resting near the fire can orient themselves around this visible center, understanding clearly where the group is located even when the wider surroundings remain hidden. This change affects how individuals interpret the darkness beyond the edge of the firelight. When people sit within a lit space, the boundary between light and shadow becomes noticeable. The eyes naturally adjust to the brighter area near the flame, making the darker surroundings appear deeper by contrast. At the same time, any movement that crosses the boundary into the light becomes easier to detect. An animal stepping closer to the camp would first appear as a shifting shadow before entering the illuminated zone. This moment of transition can provide a brief opportunity for people to notice the movement and respond. In this way, the fire acts not as a complete shield but as an early signal within the environment. It allows small changes near the edge of the camp to become visible sooner than they would in total darkness. Over long periods of time, human groups may have become accustomed to this visual boundary. The circle of light defined a place where awareness could remain active even during the night. People sitting near the hearth could look outward toward the darker edges of the camp while still seeing the faces and movements of others beside them. This shared field of awareness likely encouraged individuals to remain within the illuminated area rather than moving too far into the darkness. The arrangement also allowed several people to observe the surroundings from different directions. While one person watched a particular section of the landscape, another might notice a sound or shadow elsewhere. Without formal planning, the group collectively maintained a wider awareness than any single individual could manage alone. Archaeological evidence cannot record these exact behaviors, but the repeated placement of hearths at central points within camps suggests that fire functioned as more than a practical tool. It shaped how people positioned themselves in relation to the surrounding environment. The flame created a visible center, and the darkness beyond it became a natural boundary where human perception gradually faded. Within that boundary, the group remained together, using the light of the fire to maintain a fragile but meaningful connection to the night around them. As the night continued and the fire settled into a steady rhythm of light and warmth, the circle surrounding the hearth gradually became more than a physical space. It also became a psychological boundary. Within the illuminated area, the human senses could interpret the environment with greater confidence. Faces remained visible, gestures could be recognized, and the ground beneath one's feet could be seen clearly. Beyond that boundary, however, the world quickly returned to shadow. In the darkness outside the firelight, shapes were uncertain, and movement was difficult to interpret. This contrast between the known and the unknown likely shaped how early humans experienced the night. The flame did not simply provide visibility, it created a place where the environment could be understood more easily. For a species that depends strongly on visual awareness, this difference mattered. Humans gather information about the world primarily through sight, and when sight becomes unreliable, the brain must rely on other senses that often provide less detailed information. The firelight restored some of that visual clarity, even if only within a small radius. As a result, the area around the hearth may have felt like a stable center within a landscape that otherwise became unpredictable after sunset. Anthropologists sometimes describe this effect as the creation of a camp space, an area defined not by walls but by shared awareness. In early human camps, the fire marked the heart of that space. People resting nearby could see one another, hear quiet sounds within the group, and observe the immediate ground around them. This shared perception helped individuals remain connected to one another, even during the hours when most activity slowed. Beyond the edge of the light, however, the environment retained its independence. Animals continued to move through the landscape, winds shifted across vegetation, and distant sounds traveled through the night air. Fire did not stop these processes, but it allowed humans to experience them from a place of relative clarity. A movement at the boundary of the light could be noticed more easily than a movement hidden entirely in darkness. Over time, the repeated experience of gathering within this illuminated space may have influenced how human groups interpreted the surrounding world. The fire became a reference point from which the landscape was understood. When individuals stepped away from the hearth, they entered a darker and less certain environment. When they returned, they re-entered the shared center of the group's awareness. Archaeological patterns support the idea that hearths often remained central features within camps for long periods of occupation. Even when groups returned to the same location many times across generations, the fire tended to appear in similar areas within the shelter or open space. This consistency suggests that the hearth functioned as a stable anchor within the camp, a place around which daily activities and nighttime rest were organized. In this sense, fire did more than illuminate the ground. It defined a temporary human territory within the wider landscape. Inside that territory, the group could observe, communicate, and rest with greater confidence. Outside it, the night remained vast and largely beyond human control. Through countless evenings across deep time, this simple boundary of light quietly shaped how humans experienced the balance between safety and uncertainty in the world around them. As human communities continued to rely on fire across many generations, the hearth gradually became a defining feature of the places where people lived. In the earliest camps, shelters were often simple and temporary. Groups might rest beneath a rock overhang within the entrance of a cave, or in open ground protected by natural features such as trees or hillsides. In these early settings, the fire was not simply placed at random. The location of the hearth often reflected practical decisions about wind, fuel, and the need to maintain warmth without allowing flames to spread beyond control. Archaeological research across many prehistoric sites shows that hearths frequently appear in specific areas of shelters rather than scattered evenly across the ground. In caves, for example, fires are often found near the entrance rather than deep inside. This placement allowed smoke to escape more easily while still providing warmth and light to the living space. The entrance of a cave also offered access to daylight during the morning and evening, making it a natural place for cooking, preparing tools, or gathering as a group. By contrast, areas deeper inside caves were often darker and less ventilated, which would have made maintaining a fire there more difficult. Similar patterns appear in open-air camps. Hearths are commonly located in positions that offer some protection from wind while remaining accessible to the rest of the camp. The ground around these hearths often shows signs of repeated burning. Layers of ash and charcoal accumulate gradually over time, sometimes forming clear traces of circular or oval hearth structures. In some cases, stones were arranged around the fire to help contain the burning wood and stabilize cooking surfaces. These arrangements suggest that people return to the same basic pattern of organizing their living spaces again and again. The hearth became a predictable center within the camp. Around it, daily activities could unfold in an organized way. Tools might be stored nearby, food prepared within reach of the heat, and sleeping areas positioned at a comfortable distance from the flames. Over many occupations of the same site, these spatial arrangements sometimes left lasting patterns in the archaeological record. Clusters of tools, animal bones, and other materials appear repeatedly near ancient hearths, showing that human activity concentrated around these points. The presence of a hearth also influenced how shelters were used throughout the day. During colder periods or cooler nights, people may have spent more time near the fire, using its warmth to remain comfortable while completing necessary tasks. During warmer daylight hours, activity could shift outward into the surrounding landscape where food gathering and travel took place. When evening approached, the group would gradually return toward the fire as the central place of rest. In this way, the hearth became more than a practical tool. It functioned as an anchor within the living space, shaping how people moved through the camp and how different areas were used. Even though early shelters were often temporary, the presence of a fire created a recognizable structure within them. The flame marked the center where warmth, food preparation, and group interaction came together. Over long stretches of time, this repeated organization of space shows how fire quietly influenced the architecture of early human life, long before permanent buildings or villages appeared in the archaeological record. As the hearth became a regular element of human camps, it began to influence not only where activities occurred, but also how shelters themselves were organized. Early human shelters were rarely permanent structures. Many were simple arrangements that responded to the immediate environment: a rock wall that blocked the wind, a shallow cave that provided overhead protection, or a cluster of branches that created shade during the day. Yet within these temporary spaces, the presence of fire introduced a stable reference point around which the rest of the living area could be arranged. The placement of the hearth required careful balance. A fire needed enough open space to burn safely, but it also needed protection from strong winds that could scatter sparks or extinguish the flame. In many prehistoric sites, archaeologists observed that hearths were positioned where airflow was gentle but not completely blocked. This allowed smoke to rise and disperse while still keeping the fire sheltered. In caves, this balance was often achieved near the entrance, where natural ventilation could carry smoke outward. In open-air camps, the hearth might be placed near a rock, a slope, or a small depression in the ground that reduced exposure to wind. Once a fire was established in such a position, other elements of the camp gradually organized themselves around it. Areas used for food preparation frequently appeared within easy reach of the heat. Archaeological excavations often reveal clusters of burned bones and charred plant remains near hearths, suggesting that cooking took place nearby. Stone tools used for cutting, scraping, or shaping materials also appear frequently within this same zone, indicating that many everyday tasks were performed close to the firelight. Sleeping areas, by contrast, were usually arranged at a slight distance from the flames. While warmth from the fire was desirable during the night, sleeping directly beside an active hearth would expose individuals to smoke, sparks, or excessive heat. The arrangement that appears most often in archaeological evidence places resting spaces around the perimeter of the central fire area. In this configuration, the warmth from the hearth spreads outward, while individuals remain far enough away to sleep comfortably. This pattern creates a circular structure within the camp: the hearth at the center, activity areas surrounding it, and resting spaces farther out. Over repeated occupations of the same shelter, this circular arrangement can leave clear traces in the ground. Layers of ash accumulate where fires burned repeatedly, while surrounding areas show different patterns of debris depending on how they were used. The distribution of tools, food remains, and other materials often forms distinct zones that reflect these repeated behaviors. Such patterns suggest that early humans developed a shared understanding of how to organize their living spaces efficiently around the hearth. Even in camps that were used only temporarily, the same arrangement could appear again and again. Through this repetition, the fire quietly shaped the architecture of human shelters long before walls or permanent buildings existed. The hearth defined the center, and the rest of the camp adjusted itself around that point. In this way, fire did not simply occupy a place within human shelters. It helped define how those shelters functioned guiding the arrangement of space and the movement of people within it during the quiet hours between day and night. As the use of fire became more consistent across many human communities, the hearth slowly began to take on a role that extended beyond immediate survival needs. It remained a source of warmth, light, and cooked food, but through repeated use it also became a stable reference point within the living space. In environments where shelters were temporary and the landscape changed from season to season, this stability may have been especially important. The fire marked a place where people gathered, returned, and reorganized their activities each evening. Archaeological evidence from a wide range of prehistoric sites suggests that this central role of the hearth continued for long periods of time. When researchers excavate ancient shelters, they often find multiple layers of ash and burned material in the same general location. Each layer represents a separate moment when people built a fire, used it for cooking or warmth, and then allowed it to fade. Over years or generations, these layers accumulate and form a visible record of repeated behavior. In some caves, hearths appear again and again in nearly the same spot even when the surrounding occupation layers change. This pattern indicates that human groups returning to the same shelter often rebuilt the fire in familiar places. Such consistency suggests that the hearth had become an organizing element within the space. People may have recognized that certain areas of a shelter offered the best balance of ventilation, warmth, and safety. Once that arrangement was established, it could be repeated with little adjustment each time the site was occupied. In this way, fire helped stabilize the internal structure of places that might otherwise have remained flexible or undefined. The same principle likely applied to open-air camps. Even when shelters were built from branches or animal hides and later removed or abandoned, the position of the hearth could guide how the rest of the camp formed around it. Sleeping areas, food preparation zones, and pathways through the camp could all be oriented in relation to the central fire. Over time, this repeated organization created a predictable pattern in the way human groups inhabited space. The hearth served as a constant point within an otherwise changing environment. This role may also have influenced how people remembered and recognized particular locations. When groups returned to a familiar shelter after a period of travel, the place where the hearth had previously burned might still be visible through traces of ash or discolored soil. Rebuilding a fire in that same location could reconnect the present moment with earlier visits to the site. In this sense, the hearth did not only organize the physical space of the camp, it may also have helped anchor human memory within the landscape. Through these quiet processes, the fire gradually became embedded in the spatial habits of human life. Long before permanent houses, villages, or cities existed, the hearth was already shaping how people arranged their living areas and how they understood the spaces where they gathered each night. The flame at the center of the camp quietly defined a place where human life paused, regrouped, and prepared to begin again with the return of daylight. As fire became a familiar element within human camps, its influence slowly extended beyond warmth, light, and cooking. Over time, people began discovering that heat could also change the physical properties of materials found in the environment. This discovery did not happen suddenly or through a single moment of invention. Instead, it likely emerged gradually as people observed how different objects reacted when exposed to fire. Wood, for example, behaves differently when heated. Dry branches burn quickly, producing flames and ash, while thicker pieces of wood may char slowly and become more brittle. Early humans who spent long periods near fires would have noticed these changes simply through repeated experience. A wooden stick placed near a flame might become hardened at one end as its surface darkened and dried. In some cases, this hardened tip could become sharper and more durable than untreated wood. Archaeological studies suggest that some early wooden tools, such as simple digging sticks or spear tips, may have been strengthened in this way. Although wood rarely survives for hundreds of thousands of years, experimental research and comparisons with traditional societies indicate that controlled heating can improve the durability of certain wooden implements. These changes would have been subtle but useful, especially for tools used in daily tasks like digging for roots or probing soil. Fire also affected materials made of stone. When certain types of stone are exposed to heat, their internal structure can change slightly. In some cases, heated stone becomes easier to shape with controlled strikes from other stones. Archaeologists studying prehistoric toolmaking have identified evidence that some early humans intentionally heated particular stone materials before shaping them into tools. This process is known as heat treatment. While the earliest examples appear much later in the archaeological record than the first controlled fires, they illustrate how knowledge about the behavior of materials could develop over time through careful observation. Even without deliberate heat treatment, the presence of fire in camps may have exposed stone tools to heat accidentally. Over generations, people could notice how heated stones fractured differently from those that had not been near a fire. These observations may have gradually influenced how tools were made and maintained. Fire also played a role in shaping materials used for cooking and storage. In later prehistoric periods, the development of pottery relied directly on the controlled heating of clay. When clay is shaped and then exposed to high temperatures, it hardens into a durable ceramic material. Although pottery appears relatively late in human history compared with the earliest use of fire, it represents another example of how heat could transform natural materials into more useful forms. The connection between fire and technology therefore developed slowly. At first, the flame served basic needs: warmth, protection, and cooking. But as human familiarity with fire grew, people began to recognize that heat could alter objects in ways that extended beyond immediate survival. Through repeated experimentation, often accidental rather than planned fire, revealed new possibilities hidden within the materials of the natural world. Over many generations, this expanding knowledge gradually linked the hearth, not only to daily life, but also to the earliest stages of technological change. As human familiarity with fire continued to grow, the relationship between heat and materials gradually became more complex. Early experiences with fire likely began through simple observation. Wood burned, food softened, and stones sometimes cracked when exposed to intense heat. Over time, however, people may have begun to notice patterns within these changes. Certain materials behaved in predictable ways when placed near a flame, and these patterns could slowly become part of practical knowledge passed within communities. One example involves the shaping of stone tools. Stone tools were among the most important technologies used by early humans for hundreds of thousands of years. These tools were typically produced by striking one stone against another to remove sharp flakes that could be used for cutting or scraping. The process requires careful control because stone fractures along specific internal structures. When certain types of stone are heated before being struck, the way they fracture can change slightly. Heat can reduce internal stress within the material, allowing it to break more smoothly when shaped by controlled strikes. Archaeological evidence suggests that this form of heat treatment was used in some later prehistoric societies. While it is unlikely that the earliest fire users intentionally applied this technique, repeated exposure of stone tools to hearth fires may have gradually revealed these effects. If a stone placed near a fire later fractured more predictably during toolmaking, the connection between heat and stone quality could become apparent through experience. Over many generations, such observations might encourage deliberate experimentation with heating materials before shaping them. Fire also influenced the treatment of organic materials that rarely survive in the archaeological record. Wood, plant fibers, and animal products formed a large part of early human technology. Wooden digging sticks, spear shafts, and handles for tools were likely common in many environments. When the ends of wooden tools were exposed to gentle heat, the surface could harden as moisture evaporated and the outer layer charred slightly. This process may have increased the durability of the tool's tip, making it more resistant to wear during digging or probing soil. Although direct archaeological evidence for these early wooden tools is limited because organic materials decay over time, experiments with similar materials show that controlled heating can strengthen certain types of wood. These effects would have been visible to people who spent many evenings near fires, watching how different materials responded to heat. Fire, therefore, became a quiet partner in experimentation. Unlike modern laboratories, prehistoric camps did not separate work from daily life. Observations occurred naturally as people cooked food, maintained tools, and gathered materials around the hearth. Over time, knowledge about how heat affected different substances could accumulate without formal instruction. Each generation might inherit practical insights about which materials improved when heated and which were damaged by excessive fire. This gradual expansion of knowledge linked the hearth to the earliest stages of technological innovation. Fire was not only a tool used directly by humans, it also revealed hidden properties within the materials people relied on. Through countless small observations, stones fracturing differently, wood hardening at the edges, or plant materials drying near the warmth of the fire, the flame quietly expanded the range of possibilities available to human communities living within the natural world. As knowledge about the effects of heat slowly accumulated, within human communities, fire began to influence a wider range of activities than its earliest uses might suggest. What began as a simple flame used for warmth and cooking gradually revealed its ability to transform materials in ways that could extend human capabilities. These discoveries did not appear as sudden inventions. Instead, they emerged quietly through repeated encounters between fire and the objects people handled in their daily lives. One important example involves the heating of stones used in cooking and food preparation. In many prehistoric sites, archaeologists have found stones that appear to have been repeatedly heated and then cooled. These stones often show signs of cracking caused by rapid temperature changes. In some cases, researchers believe that such stones were placed directly in fires and then transferred into containers filled with water or food. When a heated stone is placed into liquid, it releases heat slowly, raising the temperature of the contents without the need to place the container itself over a flame. This technique, sometimes called stone boiling in later ethnographic studies, may have allowed early humans to cook foods in ways that were not possible using direct fire alone. While clear archaeological evidence for the earliest use of this method remains limited, the presence of repeatedly heated stones in some sites suggests that people were exploring different ways to use heat beyond simple roasting. Fire also played a role in altering plant materials. When plant fibers are exposed to warmth and gentle drying, they can become easier to weave, twist, or shape into cords and bindings. Early humans who worked with plant materials near a hearth may have noticed how warmth affected the flexibility and strength of these fibers. Such observations could influence how tools were assembled, how containers were constructed, or how materials were prepared for later use. In this way, the fire gradually became integrated into many aspects of material preparation. Even when it was not used directly, the warmth and controlled heat near the hearth could assist in drying, shaping, or preserving natural resources gathered from the surrounding environment. The hearth therefore became more than a source of light or warmth. It functioned as a place where the natural properties of materials could be observed and gradually understood. Each evening around the fire offered opportunities to notice how objects behaved when exposed to heat. A stone might fracture differently after being near the flames. A wooden tool might become harder or darker at its tip. Plant materials placed near the warmth might dry more quickly than those left in the open air. None of these observations required deliberate experimentation in the modern sense. They occurred naturally within the rhythm of daily life, as people cooked food, repaired tools, and prepared resources beside the fire. Over many generations, these small observations accumulated into a practical understanding of how heat could be used to modify the environment and the materials within it. Through this process, the flames slowly became connected to the earliest stages of technological creativity. Fire was no longer only a source of comfort or protection. It had become a medium through which humans could interact with the physical world in new ways, discovering possibilities hidden within the substances that surrounded them. For most of human history, the presence of fire remained closely tied to the immediate needs of daily life. It provided warmth during cold nights, allowed food to be cooked, illuminated the space where people gathered, and gradually revealed new possibilities in the treatment of materials. Yet, as human societies slowly became more complex, the relationship between people and fire began to shift in subtle ways. The flame that once required constant attention at the center of the camp would eventually become only one part of a much broader system of energy use. This transformation did not happen quickly. For thousands of generations, fire remained the primary source of controlled heat and light available to human communities. Even as early villages and later cities appeared, the hearth continued to occupy an important place within homes and communal spaces. In many ancient societies, the household fire was maintained daily, and the act of tending it remained a central routine of domestic life. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural settlements often reveals hearths placed within houses or courtyards, showing that the fire continued to serve the same fundamental purposes it had for earlier hunter-gatherer groups. The warmth it provided helped people endure colder seasons, and the heat it produced remained essential for cooking grains, vegetables, and meats. Yet alongside these familiar uses, new forms of energy use gradually began to appear. As human societies developed tools, agriculture, and larger communities, people also learned to harness other natural forces. Wind could turn simple mechanisms such as sails or later windmills. Flowing water could drive grinding stones used to process grain. These innovations did not replace fire immediately, but they expanded the ways in which humans interacted with energy in their environment. Instead of relying only on burning materials, people began to draw power from movement within nature itself. Even so, fire continued to hold a unique role. Unlike wind or water, which depend on specific locations and conditions, fire could be created and maintained almost anywhere that fuel was available. This portability made it a reliable companion of human life across many landscapes. Whether people traveled through forests, grasslands, or mountains, a small flame could still provide warmth and light during the night. Over long periods of history, however, technological developments slowly reduced the number of tasks that depended directly on open flame. New methods for lighting homes and streets appeared, first using oils and later other fuels. Heating systems evolved that allowed warmth to spread through larger structures without requiring a central open hearth in every room. Cooking methods diversified as new tools and containers were developed. These changes did not eliminate fire, but they gradually altered its place in everyday life. The flame that once defined the center of the human camp began to move into more controlled and specialized forms. It remained essential for certain tasks, yet it no longer structured every aspect of daily activity in the same way it once had. Looking back across deep time, this transition highlights an important contrast. For most of human history, life unfolded within the direct presence of fire. The flame marked the gathering place, warmed the night, and shaped the rhythms of daily activity. Only in relatively recent centuries has human life begun to move beyond that constant dependence on a visible hearth at the center of the living space. As human societies continued to develop more complex ways of organizing life, the role of fire gradually became more specialized. For most of prehistory, a fire burning in the center of a shelter or camp served several purposes at once. It provided heat, allowed food to be cooked, illuminated the space where people gathered, and helped define the structure of the living area. In later periods of history, however, these functions slowly began to separate into different systems. One example of this change can be seen in the way light was produced. In early communities, the fire itself was often the main source of illumination after sunset. The glow of the hearth allowed people to see within the living space and carry out small tasks during the evening. Over time, however, people developed methods for creating light that did not require a large open fire. Oil lamps made from stone, clay, or metal could burn small quantities of animal fat or plant oils to produce a steady flame. These lamps provided light without the smoke and heat associated with a large hearth. Archaeological discoveries from ancient settlements show that such lamps became increasingly common as human societies developed more permanent homes and structures. The presence of lamps meant that light could appear in places where a central fire was impractical or unnecessary. Another shift occurred in the ways heat was distributed within shelters and buildings. In early camps, people gathered around a single hearth because warmth spread outward from that point. In later architectural traditions, heating systems began to channel warmth through walls, floors, or enclosed chambers. Ancient heating technologies in some regions allowed heat from a fire to circulate through parts of a building while the fire itself remained contained in a separate chamber. This arrangement reduced smoke inside living spaces and allowed warmth to reach rooms that did not contain an open flame. Such innovations show how the practical functions once performed by a central hearth could gradually be redistributed across different systems. Cooking practices also evolved over time. While roasting food over an open flame remained common in many cultures, new cooking tools and containers expanded the possibilities. Clay vessels, metal pots, and other heat-resistant materials allowed food to be boiled, simmered, or baked using indirect heat rather than direct flames. These techniques made it possible to prepare different types of meals and to cook larger quantities of food for growing populations. Although fire still provided the heat needed for these processes, it no longer had to remain at the visible center of everyday activity. In some cases, the flame could be hidden beneath a vessel or within a separate cooking space. Through these gradual changes, the visible presence of fire within daily life began to diminish in certain settings. The hearth that once defined the center of the living space was no longer required for every task. Light could come from lamps, warmth from enclosed heating systems, and cooking from specialized tools. Fire itself remained essential, but its role became more controlled and distributed within the environment humans created for themselves. This transformation did not erase the long history in which human life revolved around the hearth. Instead, it marked a shift in how fire was integrated into society. The flame that once dominated the center of the camp slowly moved into the background, becoming part of systems designed to manage heat, light, and energy in new ways. As new ways of using energy slowly appeared across human societies, the visible role of fire in everyday life continued to change. For most of human history, the presence of a flame was easy to see. A hearth burned at the center of the shelter, smoke drifted upward through openings in the roof or cave entrance, and the glow of embers marked the gathering place during the night. Fire was both a practical tool and a visible companion of daily life. Yet over time, human communities began building environments where the flame itself became less central to what people saw and experienced. One of the most important shifts occurred as settlements grew larger and more permanent. Early villages and towns required new ways to organize space, particularly when many households lived close together. Open fires inside densely built structures could create challenges related to smoke, heat, and accidental spread of flames. In response, people gradually developed ways to contain fire within more controlled architectural features. Hearths were sometimes enclosed within stone or clay structures that guided smoke upward through chimneys or vents. These innovations allowed fires to remain useful for cooking and heating, while reducing their impact on the air inside living spaces. Over time, this architectural containment meant that the fire itself was no longer always the visual center of the room. The heat remained, but the flame might be partially hidden within a structure designed to manage it. Another transformation came from the increasing complexity of tools and materials used in daily life. Metalworking, pottery production, and other crafts required controlled heat, yet these activities often took place in specialized areas rather than in the center of a household space. Furnaces and kilns allowed people to reach temperatures far higher than those produced by a simple open hearth. These devices were designed to contain heat efficiently, directing it towards specific materials rather than spreading it into the surrounding room. In this way, fire continued to play an essential role in technological processes, while becoming less visible within ordinary domestic environments. Lighting also evolved in ways that reduced reliance on large open flames. Small oil lamps, candles, and later other lighting technologies allowed people to illuminate individual rooms without maintaining a large fire. These smaller light sources required less fuel and produced less heat, making them practical for enclosed spaces. As these methods spread, the glow of a hearth was no longer the only way to see after sunset. Light could appear in many smaller forms throughout a building. Over long periods of time, these changes gradually transformed how humans experienced fire. Instead of gathering directly around a central flame every evening, people could move through environments where heat, light, and cooking occurred in separate locations. The functions, once united in a single hearth, became distributed across different parts of daily life. Yet even as these changes unfolded, the deep historical connection between humans and fire remained visible in cultural memory. The hearth continued to symbolize home and gathering in many traditions long after its practical role began to shift. Looking back across the long span of human history, this transformation reveals how deeply fire once shaped the structure of everyday life. For tens of thousands of years, the flame defined the center of the human living space. Only in relatively recent periods did human societies begin reorganizing their environments in ways that allowed life to continue without a visible fire at the heart of every evening gathering. When we look across the long span of human history, it becomes clear that the relationship between people and fire was never simply about using a tool. For most of the time that humans have existed as a species, the flame quietly shaped the structure of daily life. It defined where people gathered after sunset, where warmth could be found during cold nights, and where food could be prepared in ways that made it easier for the body to digest. Long before cities appeared, before written language or permanent architecture, the fire at the center of the camp already influenced how humans organized their space, their time, and their attention. The earliest human groups likely encountered fire as a natural force within the landscape. Lightning strikes and wildfires revealed the power of burning vegetation long before humans learned to preserve or manage flames themselves. At first, fire may have been observed from a distance, something to avoid or watch carefully as it moved across the land. Gradually, however, humans began to keep small flames alive within their camps, protecting embers and feeding them with wood so that the fire could continue through the night. This step marked a subtle but important shift. The flame was no longer only part of the environment, it had become part of human life. Once fire entered the camp, it began to influence many aspects of survival. The warmth it provided allowed people to remain comfortable during cooler nights. The light it produced extended the usable hours of the evening, allowing small tasks to continue after sunset. Cooking transformed food, making certain nutrients easier to access and potentially supporting the energy demands of the human body. Even the organization of shelters changed as hearths became central points around which people arranged their activities and resting places. These effects did not appear all at once. They developed gradually through countless evenings during which human groups gathered around a flame that needed to be protected and maintained. In this way, fire became deeply woven into the rhythm of human existence. The flame was present at the end of the day when the group returned from movement across the landscape. It illuminated faces and hands while food was prepared. It remained alive as embers while people slept nearby, ready to be awakened again in the morning. Across thousands of generations, this pattern repeated itself in caves, open camps, and later in the houses of early villages. For much of human history, life unfolded within the reach of firelight. Only in the more recent chapters of history did this relationship begin to change significantly. As new technologies appeared, humans learned to produce light and heat in ways that no longer required a visible flame at the center of the living space. Electricity, modern heating systems, and industrial fuels gradually replaced many of the everyday functions once performed by the hearth. Yet the long period during which fire shaped human life remains the foundation of this relationship. For the majority of human history, the flame was not just a convenience. It was the quiet center around which the human world was organized each night. Across this long history, the presence of fire shaped not only practical routines, but also the way humans understood their place within the natural world. For most of the time our species has existed, the environment surrounding a human group did not fully belong to them. The landscape contained many forces that could not be controlled: shifting weather, migrating animals, sudden storms, and the arrival of darkness each evening. Within this larger system, the small flame at the center of the camp represented one of the few elements that humans could guide and maintain with their own hands. Yet even this control was partial. A fire could warm the night, but it could also fade if neglected or spread dangerously if the wind changed. Living with fire, therefore, required a constant awareness of balance. People learned to respect the flame's power while also depending on it. This relationship between control and cooperation reflects a broader pattern in human history. Humans rarely reshape the world through complete mastery of nature. Instead, we work within the possibilities offered by natural processes, learning how to guide them without fully eliminating their independence. Fire illustrates this principle clearly. The flame is produced by simple physical reactions between fuel, oxygen, and heat. Humans cannot change these basic laws, but we can arrange conditions so that the reaction occurs in useful ways. When wood is placed carefully within a hearth, when embers are protected beneath ash, or when fuel is added slowly to maintain warmth through the night, people are working with the natural behavior of fire, rather than forcing it into something entirely different. Over many generations, this understanding of how to live with fire likely influenced other aspects of human thought and culture. The hearth became a symbol of continuity because it required regular attention. Each evening, the flame was revived. Each morning, embers were preserved or rekindled. This repeated cycle mirrored the broader rhythm of human life itself: days of movement followed by nights of rest, seasons of travel followed by periods of return to familiar places. Fire stood quietly at the center of these cycles, reminding people that survival depended on maintaining the delicate balance between activity and care. Even in modern societies, where energy flows through complex systems of electricity and fuel networks, traces of this ancient relationship remain visible. Many cultural traditions still associate the hearth or the fire with the idea of home. Stories, gatherings, and shared meals often continue to take place around sources of warmth or light that echo the role once played by the campfire. These traditions reflect a deep memory carried through generations, a reminder that for most of human history, the flame was the place where the group returned at the end of the day. Looking back across this long timeline, it becomes clear that fire did not simply serve human needs. It shaped the boundaries of the human world. Within the reach of its light, people could see one another, prepare food, and rest with greater confidence. Beyond that circle, the wider environment continued to follow its own rhythms. In this sense, the flame did not give humans complete control over the world. Instead, it offered a small but meaningful space where the human world could exist within it. When we step back and observe the full arc of human history, the role of fire begins to appear in a different light. The flame that once marked the center of the camp was never simply a tool that humans used and then set aside. For tens of thousands of years, it quietly shaped the conditions in which human life unfolded. It determined where people could sleep during cold nights, how food could be prepared, and how far human activity could extend beyond the setting of the sun. The presence of fire created a small environment within the larger world, a place where warmth, light, and shared awareness made human life more stable than it would otherwise have been. Within that circle of firelight, the human world became visible and understandable. Faces could be seen, gestures could be recognized, and the ground beneath one's feet could be observed clearly. Outside that circle, the landscape returned to its natural rhythm, filled with sounds and movements that often remained hidden from human sight. In this way, fire quietly defined a boundary between two worlds, the small, illuminated space of human gathering and the wider environment that continued beyond it. Over countless generations, people returned to this boundary night after night. The flame allowed them to extend their presence into the darkness just far enough to remain together, to prepare food, and to rest safely before morning returned. As human societies grew more complex and technology introduced new forms of light and heat, the visible role of fire gradually diminished in everyday life. Homes no longer required an open hearth in the center of the room, and entire cities could be illuminated without a single wood fire burning nearby. Yet the long history of human dependence on flame remains embedded in the way we understand comfort, gathering, and shelter. Even today, many people feel a quiet sense of calm when sitting beside a fire, watching the steady movement of flames and the gentle glow of embers. This response may reflect something deep within the long memory of our species. For most of human history, the fire marked the place where the group returned at the end of the day. It was where warmth could be found, where food was shared, and where the uncertainty of the surrounding darkness was held at a distance. The flame did not eliminate the challenges of the natural world, but it offered a small measure of stability within it. In that sense, the story of fire is not only about technology or survival, it is also about the slow formation of a human space within the larger landscape of Earth. Through patience, observation, and repeated care, people learned how to maintain a fragile element that could easily vanish if neglected. That fragile element then helped sustain the rhythm of human life for the vast majority of our species' existence. And when we look back across that long span of time, a quiet question remains. If a simple flame once defined the center of the human world, shaping how people lived, rested, and gathered each night, what quiet forces today are shaping the boundaries of the world we now inhabit? Across the long arc of human history, the relationship between humans and fire tells a quiet story about adaptation rather than domination. For most of the time our species has existed, humans did not control the world in the way modern technology sometimes suggests. Instead, people learned how to live within natural systems, slowly discovering how certain elements of the environment could support survival when treated with patience and care. Fire became one of the clearest examples of this relationship. A flame could warm the body and illuminate the night, but only if it was protected, maintained, and understood. If neglected, it vanished. If mishandled, it could spread beyond control. The long partnership between humans and fire therefore required attention, cooperation, and respect for natural processes that humans could guide but never fully command. Over tens of thousands of years, this fragile element helped shape the rhythm of human life. It allowed groups to extend their awareness into the darkness, to cook food that sustained the body, and to gather in spaces where warmth and light made social life possible after sunset. Around a simple hearth, the human world slowly expanded beyond the limits set by daylight alone. Yet the flame also reminded people that their survival depended on maintaining balance with the environment around them. The fire consumed wood from the surrounding landscape, required oxygen from the air, and responded to wind and weather in ways that humans had to learn carefully over time. In this sense, fire was never only a tool. It was a partner in the long process through which humans learned how to exist within the wider natural world. In modern life, many people no longer experience fire in the same way. Light appears instantly when a switch is pressed. Warmth flows through hidden heating systems, and energy travels through networks far removed from the living spaces of everyday life. These technologies have made human life more comfortable and predictable, yet they can also make it easier to forget how recently our ancestors depended on a small flame to shape the structure of every evening. For the vast majority of human history, life unfolded within the reach of firelight. The glow of a hearth defined the place where people gathered, where food was shared, and where the uncertainty of the surrounding darkness was held at a distance. Looking back at that history offers a quiet lesson. Human progress has never come only from controlling the environment. It has also come from observing natural processes carefully and learning how to work with them rather than against them. Fire teaches that even a simple element of nature can shape an entire way of life when humans learn to cooperate with its properties. And as we continue to build new technologies and reshape the world around us, the deeper question remains the same one that accompanied the earliest flames in human camps. In the environments we create today, what forces quietly shape the boundaries of human life, just as fire once did for most of our history?